Okay, so it looks like most attendees have joined at this point, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to your Holacracy introduction. My name's Eric Graham. I'll be your presenter today and your tour guide to Holacracy. A couple of short things. So I'm a partner with Holacracy One, and I'm also a Holacracy coach. I have been for about 4+ years, so I help companies implement Holacracy within their organization, and I'm one of the lead coaches at our trainings in the US and in Europe, which you do on a regular basis throughout the year. So I'm also just personally very much interested in things like mindfulness and emotional intelligence and company culture. So I both like the systems of Holacracy, but also the kind of personal impact of it as well. So maybe I'll speak to that a little bit. Maybe that resonates with some others. So a quick little overview here. So we've got 40 minutes together to do a presentation and then 20 minutes of Q&A. So that timing will fluctuate a little bit as we go. You'll notice in the toolbox that you have, the little toolbar at the bottom of the screen, there should be a little Q&A icon. So if you have questions along the way and you want to queue those up, click that box and you'll be able to enter questions in as you go. We also have Laura Frew, who's also a Holacracy One partner. She's joined on the webinar as well. She'll be supporting. So she'll be supporting if there's any tech issues that come up, or she'll also be queuing up the questions. So feel free to reach out to her directly if there are any questions. You can interface with her directly in the chat. And Laura, I just want to make sure you changed your name. Okay, yeah, you're Laura now listed. Okay, great. Okay, good. And so let's just do a quick introduction for everyone. So you'll also notice you have a little chat icon in that same toolbar. Looks like some people are chatting and people are already chiming in. So great. So go ahead and just click on that chat icon and just let us know, like your name, where you're coming from, so country or city or both, and what your interest in Holacracy is. Why did you show up? Are you implementing Holacracy in your company? Are you just curious and exploring it? Or are you already using it and wanting to kind of get a little deeper dive? So just say hello to everyone. We've got a pretty good group. We've got about 70 people joining, usually a very international audience. So we got people from Spain, people from Canada, London, Germany, Bowen Island. Sweet, I've been to Bowen Island. Albuquerque, New Mexico, New York City, Washington, UK. Great. It's Irene from France, from Germany, Sweden. Cool. So welcome, everyone. It's great to have everyone. It's always fun to be introducing something that I'm passionate about to a large audience. So great to have you here. All right. So let's start to dive in. Oh, one other note. So we are recording this, and the recording will be available later. It'll be sent out in an email. So if you miss anything or if you have to jump off, know that you'll get that chance to watch it later. And Laura, make sure that it is being recorded. I can't tell that it is, but maybe it's going and I can't see it. Okay, so let's dive in. So what is Holacracy? I like to start from just like super high level, and then we'll get very granular and get into the nitty gritty. So there's a couple of things, a couple of ways that I think about Holacracy myself, and I like to share with others, just to kind of orient us and ground us in Holacracy, because it can be quite foreign in the beginning. One way I think about it is Holacracy is an alternative system for managing organizations, or I call it an organizational management system. So basically what that means, it's a way of structuring and running your organization. And really it's shifting from that typical top-down power hierarchy that we're very much used to seeing within organizations to more of what we call distributed authority. So you're taking a lot of the authorities and power that was vested in the upper tiers of the management system and filtering it down through the organization so more people have ownership and power to affect change within the organization. And it's all the kind of interworkings of the organization and how it functions. And of course, we'll talk in more detail about what that means. The other way I like to think about Holacracy is as an operating system. So similar to your computer, it has an operating system running kind of behind the scenes to your computer. It's not the apps that you're running. It's not your browser. It's not the Word program that you're using, or the document program, but it's all the interworkings of that system. It's how the communication is happening. It's how the resources are being processed. It's everything kind of behind the scenes of the operating system. Similarly, Holacracy is all of the interworkings of the organization. It's how decisions get made. It's how work gets filtered down into different roles and different teams. It's who makes what decisions. It's how you execute. So it's all the interworkings of the organization, and it's really agnostic to the organization. It can be used whether you're a multinational, international company. It can be used for nonprofits. It's used in schools. It's used in families. Some people use it within their family to run. So anytime you have a group of people with an aligned purpose trying to get work done, you can use Holacracy as your organizational operating system, so to speak. A third way that I like to think about it is as an organizational practice. And what that means is it's not something that you're just going to flip a switch on and be experts in Holacracy. It's actually something that does take time to build capacities around. You build new skills around. You let go of old habits and you build new habits. So it's something that is a practice that you develop over time within the organization. And you start from the beginning, and you know that you're going to be kind of doing it wrong in some ways, or you're going to be, there's going to be a learning curve. So I think we like to just set that expectation, normalize it, that Holacracy takes time, and it can take a couple of years to really master it and get good at. That's not to say there aren't benefits that you experience early on right away, and there are, but it starts to ingrain deeper and deeper into the organization the more you use it, and the more the entire organization uses it. So you can think of it like an organizational practice. Okay, so a couple of other kind of higher level framing before we dive into the details. So it's helpful to contrast. Holacracy is something new. It's not something that we're used to seeing in the world, many of us. So it's good to contrast it with what we're used to seeing. So here is kind of your typical, default, management hierarchy that we're used to using in organizations. So most organizations, when you start a company or you grow an organization, you don't really even make a choice on how you're going to structure your organization. Most people, anyway, don't make that choice. So there's this default to what we call the management hierarchy, where as you grow, you start to stratify into different tiers. You maybe get, director levels, you get manager levels, you get kind of frontline worker levels, you have your executive team and CEO, and it just kind of falls into that level of organization, and it's just kind of the de facto way of doing it. What we're saying is there's actually a choice, and there's new ways of organizing that are being developed in the world in response to many of the pain points and tensions that we feel within these management hierarchies. And Holacracy is one of those things. It's one of those systems that's saying, hey, there are better ways of operating and managing. So let's try to bring that in and experiment with new ways of doing that. It's not to say that the management hierarchy is a bad thing. I mean, this has been around for 100 years. It's allowed us to grow from mom and pop stores, that were tiny, to massive multinational organizations that are coordinating work worldwide, around the world, and expanding the economy, coordinating massive amounts of work, getting huge part of productivity. So there's a lot that can be owed to the management hierarchy, and there's a lot that we can learn from it, and it has its limitations. It has its shortcomings, and a lot of us in the organizational space are experiencing those shortcomings and wanting to kind of respond with newer ways of working. So let's hear from you all in the chat. I just want to hear a little bit about from you. What are some of those pain points that you're experiencing in the organizations you work for? Just start rattling off like some of the issues and tensions that brought you here. Duplication of work, lack of accountability, too much top-down, command and control, politics, exactly, blocked creativity, difficulty with decision-making, low engagement levels, lack of transparency, too long for decisions to be taken, bureaucracy, reorgs, no clear accountability. Exactly. So we all feel the tremendous amount of pain. This is what we hear every day within our organization, that people come to us to help us address. So here's the list that we, the high level list that we have: lack of engagement, unclear decision making, stifled creativity, analysis paralysis, trying to spend way too long trying to get something right instead of moving forward, painful meetings, office politics, bureaucracy. So a lot of the things that you guys are speaking to, we feel every day and are trying to respond to within Holacracy and try to build a new way of working. There's also just a broader cultural shift that's been taking place over, a decade or two, where, we have the internet, we have asynchronous communication. So people are working in different time zones and trying to get work done that aren't in the same room together. The speed of information is totally different than it was 20 years ago. You have remote teams, you have the gig economy, you have a younger generation in the millennials and others that are very turned off by that top-down hierarchical thinking and want to be more involved. And you have people that just want more kind of human ways of organizing, more kind of personal human touch, and don't want to feel like a cog in an organizational wheel. So these are kind of all the pain points that we're trying to address. And Holacracy also is not a perfect system. It has its own shortcomings, but it's an evolution forward, we feel, and it's a way to kind of take that next step into a new way of working. So the paradigm that we like to think about for Holacracy is it's really about moving from that top-down hierarchical model to what we call self-management. And so this is a term that you may be seeing more of around. We're not the only ones in this space, but it seems to be where things are moving towards, where there's a lot more power vested in the individual. There's a lot more autonomy. There's a lot more power to make decisions and take action, not in a vacuum, not in a silo, but there's a way where you can balance that autonomy and give a lot more power to the individual with coordination within the organization that's both gives power and allows people to take action, but also retains that alignment within the organization, and retains connection and retains the flow of information. So that's the balance that we have tried to strike with Holacracy, and I think do a great job actually in many ways. And another one of the analogies that we like to talk about is it's like a city. So one thing about a city is that there's really no, at least in most cities, maybe not all cities across the world, but in many cities, there is no real top-down hierarchical structure going on. I mean, there is structure. So you have different regulations, you have zoning, you have laws that are functioning within the city, but within that structure, there's a lot of entrepreneurship that's happening within the city. So there's a lot of, free market exchange happening. There's a lot of decisions that the governing body isn't going to be directing and making decisions for throughout. So they set up that structure and then let things function. And there are studies out there that show that cities actually grow in productivity as they grow in size, which is the inverse to an organization. So typically, as an organization grows, it will bog down in its productivity and slow down once you create more layers of bureaucracy. But one of our biggest clients, Zappos, if you guys are familiar with them, is an online retailer. They started selling shoes, and now there's retail, tons of different retail. They did some research, and they found that study on cities around their growth and productivity as it grows, and that's actually what drew them to Holacracy, where you can have organizational structure, but within that structure, you can have entrepreneurship, and you can have more of that independent spirit and free market going on within the organization. Okay, so that is the super high-level overview of Holacracy, just to kind of ground us in some of the principles or some of the paradigm shift that's there. let's now do the inverse, and let's dive into the nitty-gritty and into the granular of what holacracy is. So the core of how we set up holacracy is to create very small, clear roles with clear power within the organization. So normally we're used to having a certain title and maybe a job description that we start with within a company that might stagnate very quickly or be quickly outdated or is very limited in what it actually captures of the work that you do. Holacracy is saying, no, let's actually get very clear and very specific on what the roles are within the organization, and let's bullet point out exactly what those ongoing accountabilities are. So each role has both a purpose. So why does that role exist? What's its why in the world? Why is it there within the organization? What purpose does it serve? And then what are the specific accountabilities? What can the rest of the organization expect from this role on an ongoing basis? And we list out all those accountabilities. And we chunk these down into much smaller kind of boundaries than you might think. So one individual might hold a dozen different roles instead of just one title. You try to get specific and break down various different types of work, and I'll talk about why that's beneficial in a minute. But so with that clear role and with the clear accountabilities to the organization, there's a very clear authority that's given to this role. And this is kind of the heart of the shift towards self-management. So this is really our golden rule within holacracy. So every role, you have the full authority to make any decision or take any action as long as there's no explicit rule against it. And what that's saying is like, look, if you've been given the responsibility to the organization to do this accountability, you're also given the authority to make decisions aligned with that accountability. And we encourage you to make decisions. We encourage you to act and take action. You have a single point of power to take action and drive your work forward, drive your role forward. Be a CEO for your little scope of work within your organization. For that role that you serve, you're in charge. Now, there needs to be some limits and constraints on that power too, so there's a dynamic balance between that. But the default, the starting position is to give that role full authority to take action, to serve that role's purpose and accountabilities. And I'll show how we can create the balance, because you do need to be able to constrain roles when needed, and that's a dynamic thing, and that's tension-driven, as we say, and we'll get into that. But the default stance is that role has full authority to take decisions. Actually, let's go back to that. So what that really does is it undermines a lot of the politics within an organization. So if you have that kind of autonomy and you're given that kind of ownership, you're no longer relying on others to take action. So the root of politics is needing to get alignment from others. It's needing to get buy-in. So if you give that singular role more power to make decisions, that undercuts the source of politics. Now, a couple of things. It's not that role acts in a vacuum now and it doesn't get input from others, and it does. And it's all about that role using their judgment on how to integrate perspectives from other roles and from other teams within the organization. But it's up to that role to decide what's actually needed for that decision. So it gives them a lot of not only power to make the decision, but judgment on how much feedback to incorporate from others and what kind of perspectives to integrate. But then they can take that decision and move forward without having to get bogged down in socializing the idea or presenting it in a certain way to get alignment and buy-in to drive consensus. It really tries to undermine the consensus building that usually has to take place in organizations. And again, so this isn't unlimited power. There are constraints because there's areas of the organization where you want to constrain that power, and that's important to have too. So you need to have the checks and balances. But again, the default stance is to give them that kind of power. So a part of that is that you also need to clarify boundaries within the organization, so you know what that role is about. So I mentioned having a clear purpose and accountabilities. There's also something called a domain on a role, which says, look, you can give full authority on some part of the business to a particular role. So for instance, we have our web architect who owns our website. We don't want everyone in the organization being able to have full control and control of the website to be able to make changes. So this is an example where there are certain things where you want to restrict that freedom and give ownership to a particular role. So the web architect has their purpose. This is their why in the world, why in the organization. They have their accountabilities, their responsibilities to the rest of the organization. And then here's what they own as far as their body of work that others can't touch. Not every role has a domain, so it's not a requirement, it's not necessary, but when there's a certain aspect of the business you do want to give control to, then you use that domain to do it. And even then it's not out of bounds for the rest of the organization. It just means other roles now have to check with that role before they actually impact that domain, we could call it. So there just has to be a communication and a checkpoint there, and it's up to that role. So very clear boundaries. This role now, the web architect role, knows exactly what it's there to do because it has its purpose and knows its accountabilities. And if it's not listed, if the organization is asking something of it that's not listed as the accountability, the role simply says, I'm not accountable for that. That's not a part of my role's accountabilities, and you can drop it. So everything that role is responsible for needs to be made explicit as one of those accountabilities. And I'll talk about how you modify those and how you add new accountabilities to roles or change accountabilities. But that role can always rely on what it explicitly says, and they don't have to take on responsibilities, implicitly. They don't have to take on implicit responsibility within the organization if it's not made explicit within that role. So that's another thing that undercuts those power dynamics. Is oftentimes you'll get executives or people with holding more authority within the organization leaning on certain roles and kind of leveraging implied responsibility to try to get people to get something done when it's really not their role's concern. So by making everything explicit with that role, what they can say is, hey, that's not a part of my role's accountabilities. I have no accountability to the organization to handle that. And that's known within the organization that it has to be made explicit. So the role can rely on what their role, and we have a tool called GlassFrog, which is where all of this is housed, all this information around the roles, the accountabilities, the purpose, the domains, and more is housed in a software where everyone has visibility into that. And that's where it's tracked. And we'll get a look at that as we continue. Cool, so let's continue. Couple questions on chat. So yeah, we are recording this. That will be shared. The slides will not be shared directly, but the recording will be, and it has the slides. Okay, so the tool is called GlassFrog, is the tool for Holacracy, and you can look it up on the web, GlassFrog, and I'll maybe give a link at the end. Okay, so how do you evolve rules? Okay, so with that clear authority and with those clear roles, what you also need is a way to evolve those roles. And this is where the self-management really comes into play, along with the power to make decisions that's given to each role. The teams themselves, what we call circles, also have the power to evolve and change their own team structure. So what I mean by that is, here's an example. So this is our outreach circle. This is our actual circle within Holacracy 1. It has various roles. So here are how all the roles have been broken down within the organization. We have a Holacracy spokesperson, a presenter, a community host, a content publisher. All the green roles that you see are all roles that have been created by the circle themselves. It's not something that's been given to them from top down. They actually go through a process and create those roles, and they evolve the roles by creating new accountabilities on roles. And it's done through what we call a governance process. It's an actual meeting that is run within that circle, maybe every couple of weeks, maybe once a month. And they actually get together and they feel into the tensions and the issues that have impacted the circle or that are off about the circle. And they go in and they actually create and modify and change the roles within the circle. Or maybe they need to add a new domain to a new role because they realize, hey, we need to actually have, let's say, the accounting systems within the organization. We need a clear role that's accountable for that and also has the power to own that. And other roles would need to check with that role first. So that's where we have this governance process where the teams are managing and changing their own roles, their own accountabilities, their own policies. And you're doing this on an ongoing basis. So typically within an organization, you might have a reorg every year or two where there's, pain gets built up, month by month, or things are slowly diverging from where they need to be within the organization. It just gets worse and worse. But it's super costly to do a major reorg. And so you wait as long as you can, and then every year or two or longer, you do a massive reorganization. You try to get back into alignment with the true requisite structure of the organization. And then you go through that process again over time. What Holacracy is saying is no, let's do that every couple of weeks, maybe once a month, once you're more experienced at this, and you're constantly tweaking your organizational structure. And every single team within Holacracy is doing the same thing. So all this structuring is going on throughout the organization by the individuals who are on the front lines experiencing the actual issues within the organization. So that's one of the major elements of power that's distributed that throughout the organization that's usually preserved for the executive team or the CEO, leadership, top leadership. This is now part of being in the organization. And there's tremendous benefits to that, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And one is that creates more engagement. Because if you're in a role within your organization, you're experiencing tension day to day throughout your job, but you don't have a clear pathway to process that tension and try to affect change, that's when you slowly start to kind of check out, or you slowly start to kind of become disinterested in your work and disengaged, is when you can't actually address the real issues that you feel. But if you have a clear pathway, which is that governance process to affect change within your organization, that keeps the aliveness within the individual and within the organization. That keeps things growing and changing and evolving on a more regular basis. And so it takes what we call a more iterative approach. So you actually become more of a tension processing organism, if you will, within that system. So you're using tension as something to actually drive change. Whereas tension or anything that's off about the organization is typically something you either try to ignore or you try to work around it and try to figure out a way to just get the work done, even though the structure is out of alignment. You just kind of work around the structure. It's saying, no, let's actually feel that tension, literally feel the tension, the frustration in your body as you're doing your work. Feel what's off about how the organization is structured. Capture those tensions in a notepad or in a document. And we encourage this all the time, to capture your tensions that are coming up day to day throughout the doing your work. And that might be things falling through the cracks, that's not getting done, that nobody's clearly accountable for. It might be that the work you're doing is actually evolving, like you're pivoting into a new form of work within your organization, and that's a different structure is needed to address that new work. So, and that's a tension. That's something you capture, and you can actually bring into that governance process and evolve the structure of those roles and of the team to address the new work. And so we're saying no, tension is a good thing. That's a sign that something within the organization is off. And now you have a clear pathway on how to process that tension. Sometimes they're very small tensions. Sometimes it's something like, hey, this email after this event, keeps getting missed, and we need somebody that's accountable for sending out the follow-up email after the event. It could be something major like, this new software platform we're doing is not working. We need to drop that line of business and focus our attention elsewhere. And you might dissolve an entire circle or an entire team within an organization. And so that kind of evolution is taking place on a regular basis, both very small and on a very large scale. But the key here is that there's a real mindset shift where tension is taken as a form of informing change. It actually is it's kind of the engine that's driving change in holacracy. Okay, one thing, just a note of caution is beware of over-design within holacracy. So we also like to, it's easy for us as human beings to kind of get ahead of ourselves and try to design a perfect system. And we think we have the image in our mind about what our organization should be and what it should look like, and we try to map the perfect organizational structure. That's actually something we try to restrain from and say, no, exercise some constraint and let those, more iterative day-to-day decisions and tensions drive the evolution of the organization. And what you'll find is you'll have a more perfect, a more fine-tuned design, organizational design over time that's done by the individuals doing the work rather than having kind of this overarching perfect design. So it's aware, we're trying to say, let it be sure that it is tension driven, look, and it doesn't have to be negative tension. It can be positive tension. So it can be you're sensing an opportunity within the organization that's there. And you want to help create an organizational structure that meets that new opportunity, but you want to keep it grounded. You want to have it grounded in something real, something tangible that you're experiencing within your work within the organization, and not get too involved in designing from mind. You want to let it be real, and use that tension to drive change. Okay, so let's see, where is my clock? Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit faster, kind of going a little short on time. So another analogy that we like to use is this basically makes everyone within the organization a sensor for the organization. So you now have every role, every individual within the organization serves as a sensor for that tension. So everyone is encouraged to feel the tension, use it to drive change, and now that they have that clear pathway, through that governance process, they can drive change structurally throughout the organization. So another really powerful distinction that we use within holacracy is that you can really think about the work that you're doing as working in the organization and working on the organization. So we're all used to working in the organization. That's what we do every day. That's the roles we're doing. That's the work we're doing to move our organization forward. You could call it operations, you could call it, logistics, all of that. And holacracy also has a meeting called the tactical meeting, which is a very structured way of running those operational meetings and driving the work forward. What's kind of, and we don't spend as much time on that within this presentation because that's more what we're used to. But the working on the organization is really what holacracy is trying to bring that's unique in that governance process. It says, okay, look, let's actually take a step back from the work we do in the organization, and let's take an hour, every other week or every month, and let's reflect on the organization. Let's look how we're structured. Let's look what's working. Let's look at what's not. And take a little bit of time every so often to help streamline and increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization. So even though it's a little bit painful to take that time to reflect and change the organization, it actually goes, it's like a tenfold return on taking that time to do those, small adjustments within the organization to help streamline things going forward. So, it's like you want to kind of re-up the organization, realign the organization to the work that it's doing on a regular basis, because that work is changing. And that's part of what we find within organizations is things are evolving on a regular basis. You're the organization is evolving, the work is evolving, and you need a system and a structure that can match the way that work is changing these days. And that's what Holacracy really is trying to do. So this is a little bit of a broader example of what a smaller organization would look like. So this is an actual org chart. So instead of having that typical top-down hierarchical org chart you used to see, we now see kind of what are like concentric circles. And you have this GCC is what we call the general company circle. That's the broadest circle, which would classically be the executive body. And really, they hold the broadest scope. So there's a misconception often in Holacracy that it's a flat organization or that there's no structure. And that's simply not true. There is actually quite a bit of structure within Holacracy, and you can see it right here. You have broad circles. Then you get into smaller circles, which have even smaller level of scope, even more focused. And then within each circle, you have each role. And they have even smaller scope and even a smaller level of focus. But it's all aligned to the purpose of the organization. So you have purpose alignment throughout each organization, throughout each level of the organization, each circle. And you also have, I'll point out quickly here, each circle, you've noticed maybe that there's the green roles and then there's these blue roles as well. So each organization, each circle has their green roles. Those are the roles that they've created as a circle. Each circle also has these 4 roles that are standard to every circle within the organization. One is called a lead link. One is called a rep link or a representative link. The other one is a secretary, and the other one's a facilitator. So the lead link is responsible for kind of driving the overall purpose of that circle. And there's various other roles around role filling and getting the right people matched up to the right roles. It's kind of the closest role to your conventional manager, but it's more about directing the system of the role of the circle and not directing the work. The individual roles are directing the work. They're making sure you have alignment with the right role fillers. And they'll sit on the super circle, they'll sit on the broader circle, and they'll be on the subcircle underneath it. So a lead link would both be on the GCC circle level, and they would be on, let's use the development circle as an example. And then you have the rep link, which is the representative of the circle, and it's looking out for the tensions of that circle, and it's representing those tensions in the broader circle. So it's sitting on both the development circle and on the general company circle. And so what you have is this two-way flow of information between the lead link and the rep link. One kind of coming from the top down, looking out for the purpose and the success and driving the work forward. And the other one looking out for the health and the functioning and the resources of that circle and sitting up on the general circle. So that's this two-way flow that happens at every level of scale throughout the organization. So that creates this really beautiful kind of two-way communication going up and down the organization. So that's just, there's a lot more I could go into those particular roles, but that's very high level. And I'm going to move through this and try to get to our questions. I know there are some. So again, just as a reminder, as we kind of near the tail end, so there's this Q&A box you should see on the toolbar, so feel free to enter questions in there, and I'll be getting to those shortly. So here's an example. So this is the scalability of Holacracy as well. So here's Zappos. This was a snapshot of their organization quite a while ago now, so I'm sure it's changed. But you can see they have multiple levels of circles upon circles and then roles within those circles. And so this is how it scales up and down throughout a larger organization. Okay, so this is one of the fundamental parts of Holacracy is that it's all outlined in what we call the Holacracy Constitution. So everything that is Holacracy, all of the rules, all of the ways of operating, all the expectations of the system itself is baked into a rule book. It's about 40 pages long. It's pretty simple read. You can read it in an hour and see all of what Holacracy is. So this is what makes it also very transparent and explicit. everybody, when an organization takes on Holacracy, basically the CEO, the previous power holder, is vesting their power and authority into this new system. And they're saying, look, I now cede my power to the constitution of Holacracy. They're saying this is now the power of the land. These are the rules of the game that we're going to be playing, and we all agree to play by these rules. And then it's now Holacracy is how the organization is operating. And nobody has that power beyond those rules of the game. So this is what kind of makes that symbolic shift into Holacracy by kind of signing the Constitution, and then everyone has visibility into the rule book of Holacracy. So between that as the fundamental rule book of Holacracy and your organizational structure, everything is completely explicit. Everything is available for everyone to see and to understand. So you can basically grok an entire organization by looking at those two things. And I'll mention that the Constitution itself is evolving. So we're learning about democracy and what works and doesn't every day. And so we incorporate that feedback, and we have a whole community of advanced practitioners who are giving us input on Holacracy as a system itself, and it's going through its own iterative processes. So you're saying we're on 4.1 right now. We're actually working on 5.0, which will be a new form, and it's incorporating the learning that we've had, and that's been going on for 10 plus years. So it's quite robust and developed at this point, and it will continue to evolve over time as we learn and incorporate feedback. Okay, so a quick high-level summary of the key shifts, and then we'll wrap it and we'll go into questions. So a couple of key shifts. So top-down power hierarchy moves to what we call distributed authority. So both distributing the power for individual roles to make decisions within their roles and to actually structure their own teams, what we call circles. So they actually can impact the structure of the organization, and they can have the power to make decisions within their roles to drive their work forward with some constraints that you can put on. I didn't get into a lot of details around the constraints. There's something else called policies that you can also do in that same governance process, where you can direct how work needs to take place. So for instance, if you're going to update the website, you need to follow X, Y, and Z channels. Or if you're going to update the accounting software, you need to notify X, Y, Z roles. Like, you can dictate certain things that need to happen. So you also have those levers to dictate, what takes place, because there are certain things in the organization that need that while still retaining the power within those individuals. Okay, so static job descriptions that we're all typically used to coming into organizations with transform into dynamic roles. So individuals fill usually multiple roles. It's not, sometimes you still have highly specialized roles. So you might have an individual that comes in and fills a software developer role, and they may only have one role. So sometimes it's just depends on the situation and the context. An individual might come in and fill one role. Another individual might be more of a generalist, and they might fill many roles across the organization. You can fill a role within one circle. You can fill a role within multiple circles. So it's really kind of variable depending on what's needed for the organization. So it's moving from large-scale reorgs into what we call tension-driven iteration. So bringing in that evolutionary engine where you can slowly grow and evolve the business and the structure over time. And then alignment by politics to alignment by purpose. So again, you saw the purpose on each role, and that purpose is really tied to the purpose of the circle above it. And that circle's purpose is tied to the purpose of the broadest organizational circle. So you have this kind of purpose-driven alignment that's going throughout the organization, and you're giving those individuals the power to drive their work forward, to be a CEO within their role, as long as it's aligned to the purpose and accountabilities of that role. Okay, so that is Holacracy in a whirlwind nutshell. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to jump into questions. And then I'll talk about a few next steps. If you guys want to actually go deeper into this and take a deeper dive, I'll go into that before we wrap up. Okay, so I know you guys have a bunch of questions. Laura has been also queuing up questions on her side, so I'm going to go through a list that we've got here. And okay, so how do you deal with an inequality of psychological skill? Even if you remove formal hierarchy, surely this kind of system is vulnerable to people who are better at persuasion or have more education privileges, etc. Okay, so yes, there's always, whether it's psychological skill or emotional capacity or even just skill within the organization, yes, you're always going to have people with inequality. And well, I guess there's two parts to this question. I think what you're asking is it going to be vulnerable to people or persuasion? Yes. So holacracy is not going to be the end-all, be-all, complete, dissolving of office politics. I think that's just too much to ask of any system and impossible. But so you're going to have individuals still trying to use power and persuasion to impact other people and try to drive their agenda in the organization. What holacracy does is it gives you explicit ways of kind of undermining that persuasion. So one is that, like I said, it gives you your role, it gives you your role's purpose, and it gives your role has accountabilities. And holacracy says if it doesn't align to your role's purpose and accountabilities, you have no responsibility to fulfilling on it for the organization. So what it does is give you the power to say, you know what? Thanks for your input. I appreciate your perspective. And that doesn't align to my role's purpose and accountability. And what it does is differentiate you as a human being making decisions from your role and what your role's purpose and accountability is. And so it depersonalizes those decisions. And so what it does is gives you a way to rely on that role to say, in my judgment, which I've been given within the organization, the judgment to make decisions on this role, that what you're asking of me doesn't align with my role's purpose and accountabilities. And that's something that the organization needs to respect, is that people have been given that authority to make those decisions. So people can try to persuade and try to use power, but you can always rely on what's explicit. And so there's not as much implicit power that's being used, or it can't be used as powerfully as it once could. So that's kind of one of the key shifts that undermines that power. And so what we do is we do want to use persuasion. We want to make that a healthy part of the organization. So we don't want people to not share their opinions. What we do is change the language from persuasion to a pitch. And we say, look, you can always pitch another role, what you think should happen, but make it explicit. Tell that role what you think should be done in their role. Tell them very directly. You don't need to kind of, you mince your words. You can be direct. And, at the end of the day, that role has the full authority and power to make decisions based on that role's purpose and accountabilities. And that's what they're going to do. And that's part of the learning curve, is people actually also owning that power. So there's one thing about, removing the power of people that typically were the power holders. There's another part of it that's empowering people to stand up for themselves, hold their boundaries, and actually drive their role, given their purpose and accountability, and stand into that power. And that is one of the big learning curves. But that's actually one of the deeply powerful aspects of holacracy. And what holacracy can offer is it helps develop empowerment within an organization. And this is what I've seen and lived in our organization for 5 years now that I've worked here within Holacracy. One is it really does develop that empowerment within individuals to stand behind their roles. Okay, so hopefully that answered that. Thinking about tensions, some of them can be pretty large and sometimes feel impossible to solve. For instance, cultural dynamics, external market forces, and changes of global policies. What is Holacracy's approach to managing these types of challenges? Okay, so yeah, you're going to have tensions of various sizes and various issues. What Holacracy does is the first thing you need to do whenever you have a tension that's not clear what to do with, you need to get a clear role filler who owns that role and owns that tension. So let's say you have cultural dynamics and that becomes an issue. Okay, first things first, we need to have is there a role in the organization that's responsible for considering and thinking through cultural dynamics? Maybe not. Maybe you don't have a cultural liaison role or a culture shaper role or something along those lines. So the first thing you do is create that role. Then then the lead link has to figure out who's the right role filler for that role. Once you have a role filler, once you have a role, you have explicit accountabilities that you would create on that role. So maybe it's, understanding the core interpersonal dynamics of the organization and applying training to help resolve interpersonal issues or something like that. If you get a few of those really key accountabilities that you want to expect of that role, you get a role filler, and now you can request a project of that role. Now that there's a clear role, you have a clear role filler, you get a project of that role, you say, resolve interpersonal dynamics in, this team or something. Now, if you're a role filler, you've got accountabilities, you've got a project, now you've got a role filler who has the power and the authority to start to drive change, whatever they need to do in that role to affect that change, and it's up to them. They may gather feedback, they may ask people for information, they have all sorts of tools they can use to fulfill on that role, but you now have those tools to set all that up and get that engine moving towards making that change. It's not that Holacracy is going to come in and solve all your culture problems. It's not going to come in and solve your market force problems, but it's going to give you the tools to create those role filler, to create the role, create the accountability, get the role filler set up, get a project on that role, and get them empowered to start making those decisions. That's what Holacracy does. That's what it can help you do. Whereas in another organization, you might be like, okay, we have a whole new issue and we have no roles that are accountable for that. We need to, what do we do? You get more stuck without having the tools to affect that change. Okay, so how are cross-functional processes managed within the system? Are those specific accountabilities? Yeah, so there's different ways of structuring the organization. You can be more functional, where the circles are more functional. You have certain teams or structure or circles that are cross-functional. So you might have a project circle that has roles from different functional teams that all get together and are running a project in a specific circle, who are now their own their own entity. They're managing and running themselves, and they're doing the work of the organization. So what Holacracy does is give you the way to create and destroy circles to both either be more of a matrix organization or a functional kind of organization, or both. It can be a hybrid where you have functional circles and you have those hybrid kind of matrix style circles. And now that becomes an entity that's self-managing themselves and running themselves. Holacracy has this clear structure with roles and circles. It doesn't mean that circles can't just work with other roles directly. That's another misconception, is that you can only work within your circle or something along those lines. No, that's just structure that's available for you, but it doesn't restrain the organization. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't limit what you can do. You can still work across the organization however is needed. And at some point it might be, once there's enough work for a clear period of time that needs to get done, it can be useful to form a circle, create that entity, and have them self-managing. Okay, so how does this differ from the age-old concept of empowerment? It doesn't. It is the age-old concept of empowerment. It's trying to empower people, but what it's doing is giving a system that explicitly is telling you, look, you have the authority to, unless there's an explicit rule against it, you have the authority to run your role, to take charge of your role, to be CEO, and that is the overarching message within this system. Not only that, you can affect the structure of the organization to help you get your work done. within the organization. You can actually affect the structure of the organization to help you drive that work forward. So what it does is it just kind of puts your money where your mouth is and says you to be empowered, but here's the way you can do it. And it gives you the tools to do it. So without those clear channels and pathways, empowerment doesn't mean that much. But in Holacracy, it's real because you have those channels. So what are the biggest risks and things to watch out for when adopting Holacracy? So there's a couple things. So one is there needs to be a strong desire to implement Holacracy. As kind of I said in the beginning, it is a practice. And with any practice, it takes time to develop and get good at it. So there needs to be staying power. There needs to be the drive to stick with it when it gets challenging, because it will get challenging. I mean, Holacracy is no different than any other kind of change management situation where you're moving from an old structure to a new structure, an old way of working to a new way of working. That's going to create its own pain and its own frustration and its own learning. So there needs to be the commitment to stick with it even when it's challenging. And we see there's kind of this typical initial phase of excitement and everyone's into it and liking it. And then it gets a little bit more challenging as it gets maybe a little bit more deeply embedded in the organization, or maybe it starts to challenge some of the old power dynamics in a deeper way. And it can get frustrating, or maybe people are not, not everyone is as on board as some, and that's going to happen. That's just the diversity in any organization is going to have that. So there needs to be the commitment, the understanding of the path, the understanding of the difficulties, and the commitment to get through it. That's one of the big ones. But what we do is just normalize that, say, yes, that is a part of it. That is the learning curve, and that needs to be known up front. And we sometimes challenge our clients as to why they shouldn't adopt Holacracy, and just to make sure that there's enough resilience within the organization, enough alignment to actually, implement a whole system change like this. Okay, so what's the next step if you want to work with Holacracy? So a couple of things. One, there's a couple ways of doing it. One is you can kind of what we call bootstrap it, which is, go about it yourself. You basically, we have trainings available. So the first thing would be to attend our 5-day practitioner training and get at least, a certain portion of your organization going to this training. It's going to teach you the structure of Holacracy. It's going to teach you how to run those meetings. It's going to teach you how to facilitate the meetings, which is one of the key roles, is facilitating meetings. It runs you through a whole simulation on working with Holacracy within a real business. It's a scenario. It's kind of a fake scenario, but it shows you how to process tensions. So it's a 4.5-day training in the US and Europe and elsewhere. So if you get a certain, the executive team or leadership in that training, you guys will have the tools to start to adopt it on your own. We also are starting to launch virtual trainings. So if you go to holacracy.org, there's online trainings where you can start to learn it. And you basically, the first big step is to sign that constitution and say send the message throughout the organization. You're going to launch Holacracy. There's a path to, you need to structure the organization from the old structure to the new structure. But we also can help you through that. So we also offer coaching and consulting where we can partner with you to walk you through that process. And there's more that it would be too big of a conversation to go into that. But I think there's also resources on our website and on Medium about bootstrapping. You can start there, or you can just reach out to us directly through our Contact Us link and engage us about coaching and understand what that would look like. Okay, so we are at time. It's 10 o'clock. I'm going to do just a little kind of next steps to wrap it up. And then I'm sorry I didn't get to as many questions as there are, and I wish I could have, and hopefully I will do more questions next time. But feel free to reach out to us directly if you want to through our website. That Contact Us form, we have people who want to be advisors for you and help you kind of with questions and with the journey. So reach out to us. A couple of next steps, as I've said, you can go to our website. There are trainings on our website. There are resources. you can read about Holacracy and go deeper with. You can look at the Constitution and read the Constitution and get a good sense of it. Let's see, what else? Next steps. Let me see if I have. I guess I don't have those listed out. So yeah, I think that's it. So another thing I'll say is I'm actually running what we call a taster tomorrow and the next day. So Wednesday and Thursday, it's a taster where it's this introduction plus you actually get to run with a live simulation. So I will be a facilitator. I'll run a tactical meeting, Holacracy style. I'll run a governance meeting, Holacracy style. People are filling roles. You know, you're reading about a role with their tensions, and you actually get to experience it firsthand. That's actually better than this one, because this you're just hearing about it. That one you get to experience it. So if you do want to sign up for that, there are still seats left. It's virtual, just like this. It'll have an intro, which you could just kind of like multitask through in the beginning or join a half hour into it. But I'll just say that's actually a great next step if you really want to get a firsthand taste. That's on the website. Laura's putting up some links in the chat. We're over time, so I'm going to leave it there for now. I will say thank you all very much for being on the webinar. I hope you found it informative, and reach out to us with questions. We would love to keep hearing from you. There's a broad, community of people that are interested in Holacracy that you can connect with. We have what we call the community of practice, which you can find on the website. And yeah, again, I wish we could have gotten to more questions. I will move faster next time. And that's it. I'll wrap up there. Thank you all again very much. We hope to hear from you soon, and take care and enjoy the rest of your day. The recording will be sent out in the next day or so, I imagine. Okay, take care, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye for now.